And I think it is really fitting that we ended our symposium with a conversation around leadership, but also fitting that our last address will be from a leader that we've all been very impacted by. So I believe in speaking well about people when they aren't there, but I also believe in speaking well about people when they are. So Brie and I just wanted to say a few words about Helen before we invite her to the stage for the last time. Because for us, Helen has really exemplified the type of leadership spoken about today. Helen has convened ERA to huge, tangible impact. She's wrangled the folks in this room expertly into discussions, policy submissions, and she's also led quiet and loud advocacy and diplomacy. Helen has accumulated huge knowledge and expertise, and then she's patiently sat with many of us to explain what CEDAW is, why the budget papers are the way they are, why human rights actually matter, and what the unspoken processes are that accompany the official ones. Helen has held the energy for us as a collective when we have been distracted, engaged elsewhere, unsure, or just unwilling. She's been consistent, and some would say relentless, in her pursuit of not only gender equality and equity, but also in ensuring that it was a collective that pursued those things at the federal level, and that it was the collective that was the vehicle for the change that we're calling for. Critically, Helen has enabled us to build community, not only in our professional roles, but as people. She has built and then opened an incredibly impressive address book, and it is all of us that have benefited. So this may be the last time that Helen addresses us in her professional role as convener as ERA in a public forum, but it sure as hell won't be the last time we hear from her as a person. And so I guess I wanted to just say a massive thank you on behalf of all of us, Helen, for bringing us together and ensuring that all the connections that follow from this symposium, but also from ERA in general, are possible because of the work that you have led. Thank you, Helen.
All right. I have a fabulous closing speech for you. It's in my bag over there. And what's in front of me is a series of hastily scribbled notes that are actually not in linear fashion. So what you're about to see is a woman who is 2-3 years into an ADHD diagnosis, enacting that in front of you because I'm leaning into me. So we are a group of people who came together to talk about what we think we might do about the fact that ERA is coming to an end. At the same time, we're also talking about what it is that our hopes are, what it is that our powers are, what it is that we are doing actively among ourselves, what it is that we could be doing. And we've done that. This has been the most amazing day and a half, and I can't thank all of you enough for making this the day and a half it's been. We're facing challenges. We've always faced challenges. This is nothing new. The challenges we're facing now, maybe they're challenges at this point in time, but they are challenges that, A, we've surmounted in some ways before, or we've surmounted similar things. They're challenges that we are not alone in facing, and we are certainly not alone in addressing. And they are challenges that I think have the capacity to make us stronger, better focused, and better connected in the work that we're doing. Some of the challenges that we've identified over the last couple of days have included this pushback that we're seeing. You can describe it as a pushback on human rights, you can describe it as a pushback on women's rights or on gender equality. It doesn't matter much which way you frame it. Ultimately, it's a pushback on the redistribution of power. It's a pushback on that fundamental idea that fairness means not everybody, or a small group of people not accumulating all the good stuff. And we're seeing that manifest all over. You know, it's not just the women's rights sector. We've seen it in climate. We've seen it in the defence of our democracies. We're seeing it across a whole range of areas. Disruption in our public spaces is deliberate, it is targeted, and as we were saying in the panel on human rights, it's easy. The work that we're doing is not easy, but ultimately it's achievable, and it's something that we are all, I think, committed to. We're also facing this global failure to appreciate the importance of redistributing power. So we are at a point in time where we have achieved most of the low-hanging fruit when it comes in particular to gender equality. We've picked off initial things like, let's remove legislation that says you can pay women and men differently for doing the same job. And then we found it was a little more complex than that. And so we ended up establishing the Workplace Gender Equality Agency. And then the data from that organisation has taught us that actually it's not as simple as saying men and women. Let's be a little more nuanced. Let's dig into what that means. And it's not as simple as saying equal work for equal pay. Maybe it's equal pay for work of equal value. And so each step in that sort of archaeology metaphor I was using earlier brings us to a new level of complexity, and therefore brings us to a new level of challenges that we need to address. And that's, I think, the process that we're seeing right now. We are in a space where the old models for example, funding women's organisations no longer work. And we've heard from our panel yesterday about what are some of the other options for looking at how you support the work that we're doing. How do we do it differently? How do we ask governments to do it differently? How do we ask the community to do it differently? How do we ask philanthropy? We are identifying now the starvation model of funding for not just women's rights, but let's face it, predominantly women's rights, because work done by women is undervalued. And the work on gender equality, as James has pointed out, is primarily being done by us. And so I think that we're at a point similar to where we were when we got rid of the legislation that says you can't pay men and women differently. We're at the point now where we're starting to go, actually, the issue around funding our organisations, it's a bit more complicated than the issue about how much we get. It's about what we value in those contracts. Do we value the outcomes or do we value the process? Do we value the establishment of these spaces? How do we impose conditions on that work? Are we controlling the work of those organisations, or are we enabling and building it? Are we trusting those organisations? And so there's a real moment of change for us happening around the very way that we engineer our work, the ways we do it. Here's the ADHD bit. Now I've got to go to 2. There we go. Some of the things we've learned over the last couple of days. We've learned that what we need to be doing is resetting narratives about what matters. And we heard that right from our first panel on climate change, all the way through to the discussions we've just heard about models of leadership. What do we mean when we say a leader? And what do we mean when we say do intersectionality? We've learned that we're learning how to do this as we go. And I guess that's the point of everything I've been saying so far, is that we don't know the answers, but that's okay. That's not a failing in us. It's because no one's done this before. We're building new things out of nothing, out of ourselves. We're building new ways of seeing the world. We're building new structures. We're building new pathways for people. And that's not an easy thing to be doing, but we're doing it. And we've been doing it for generations. We've learned that process and relationships, the building of spaces like this, the space for us to be able to think about how we do, the how instead of the doing, are as important as being able to point to outcomes. We've learned that concepts of vulnerability, we've learned that vulnerability itself and the lack of power are not innate to people. And I think this is the great thing that human rights tells us. We are all born free and equal, and then something happens. And it's that something that is the focus of our work. Systems of power exclusion from decision-making, marginalising practices and attitudes. These are the things that create vulnerability. People are not vulnerable. People become vulnerable in certain situations and places. We've talked a lot about silos. We've talked a lot about power and about how the fundamental thing that we are doing here is the redistribution of power. We've talked about how this climate of change that we're experiencing, and I'm thinking specifically about Caro's points about epochal change, and about how that environment of change leads to fear. And it's that fear that's driving the pushback and the challenges that we see. And we're seeing that we've learned that it's critical to centre care of ourselves, care of our country, care of our communities. And that's where I want to say something that hasn't come up in this session so far. This is my personal soapbox, so I'm going to just step onto it and give you this. We also have an epochal change ahead of us that we don't talk very much about because the argument has got prickly at best and damaging at worst. In my view, the breakdown of the gender binary is the best thing to happen to feminism since feminism. Let me explain, because I don't want this to turn into a sense of some people in the room feeling like Helen agrees with me and some people in the room feeling marginalised about it, because there are real questions to be asked here. We need to be able to have discussions about this, but right now we can't. But what leads me to make that statement is that the basis of our redistribution of power has to sit in a breakdown of the idea that patriarchy gains its power from binary structures. Us and them, men and women, black and white. And you can see the truth of that when you look at how hard patriarchal capitalism works to decide what race people are. All that anxiety around people of mixed race, all that stuff about whether you're this side of the boundary or that side of the boundary. Patriarchy wants us in one of two boxes. And the point at which the power that underpins patriarchy starts to break down is the point at which you can't tell which box someone is necessarily, or the point where someone chooses their box. So we are living, I think, at a time of great challenge, but also massive opportunity. But it's going to take us a lot of energy, it's going to take us a lot of intellectual work, and it's going to take us a lot of compassion and heart to be able to do the thinking, the reconceptualisation of what we look like in a post-binary world. And I just want to be clear, I'm not saying that people are not, that people themselves are in any way going to need to change their own identities. You are who you are, and if you are a woman or a man, that's fine. But what's important is that structurally, we are not replicating the power systems of patriarchy by insisting that everybody fits those categories. That's my 2 cents worth, and I'm stepping off the soapbox now. But what I want to leave you with on that is that there is opportunity in front of us, and that success might not look like what we thought it was going to look like. So, in order to wrap us up, I would just like to say, I'm not going away, you're not going away. ERA was a tool that we used to make change. It was a space that we built over 23 years to learn, to grow, to meet and to support each other. It was the embodiment of an idea. The idea that change, radical change, is possible and necessary. The idea that the voices of all women matter in that process. And when I say women, I mean all diverse women. The idea that the human rights of women are not only important, but also that they are critical to the overall health of our communities and our democracy. And the idea that the change we seek must be not just informed, but driven and defined by the women who need that change to occur. There's a space ahead of us. It's the space where ERA used to be. We can choose how we see that space. We can be daunted or we can be excited. I invite you to change the language that you're using around this time and place within your head, the language you use to yourself and the language that you use to others. Not we have to, but we get to. Not what have we lost, but what have we got and what can we get? And finally, both what have we achieved and what do we want to achieve? There have been lots and lots of lovely comments. There's been a little bit of Helen love in the room over the last day and a half, and I have to say I've really appreciated that. But I also reflect that this is the room, this is part of the massive network of women from ERA who made me what I am. And I want you to reflect on that when you think about the call that the Young Women's Advisory Group people made to support their efforts to drive and lead a conversation of intersectional advocacy. Because I can tell you, I was much less promising material than they were. And look what you made out of me. Think what you could do with them. That's the note I'm going to leave you with. For those of you who are staying on for the next day and a half, I'm looking forward to, really excited to work with you on those questions about what we can achieve. And for those of you who are leaving us but will continue to be part of the conversation, thank you for giving us your time, your expertise. To everybody who participated in a panel or who moderated a panel, to everybody who patiently explained to me that you don't actually need to do all the things, Helen, to the YWCA staff who pitched in to help, to our YWAG members, Bree and Tash, who have so beautifully guided us through this over the past day and a half, to the staff at the Wheeler Centre who dealt with a really astonishing number of technical questions from us about how does the thing work. And finally, and above all, to Maddie, who has stood by me, and to all the other ERA staff members who've equally stood by me over the years and helped us to actually get this stuff done. Thank you to all of you. Let's keep this conversation happening. Cheers. Lunch.